Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a CIEEM webinar on biodiversity net gain opportunities for Scotland. This webinar will be presented by Vicky Patton from Ramble, Julia Baker from Balfour Beatty, Tom Butterworth from WSP, Rachel Hoskin from Footprint Ecology, and Frances Williams from Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks. Julia will be starting the webinar, and before I hand over to her, I would just like to let you know that we will be doing a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So if you'd like to submit a question to us, there should be a Q&A button at the top of your screen. So if you just type in your question and press submit, and we will look to answer those at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Julia. Thank you, Julia.
Great, thank you. Can I just check you can see my screen okay?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Great, good afternoon everyone. We'd like to start with thinking about, well, what is biodiversity net gain? And earlier this year, we had the definition from DEFRA. They phrase biodiversity net gain as delivering more or better habitats for biodiversity and demonstrating this measurable gain through use of the DEFRA biodiversity metric. So it's not just enough to deliver more or better habitats. An inherent part of biodiversity net gain is to demonstrate a measurable net gain. They also call biodiversity net gain development that delivers improvements through either habitat creation or enhancements. So already we've got a couple of options for how we achieve net gain, but the important point here is after avoiding or mitigating harm. And this relates to what we refer to as the mitigation hierarchy. And it's a series of steps starting with avoiding harm to then minimize, remediate, and finally to offset. And that is critical because that mitigation hierarchy is biodiversity net gain. Biodiversity net gain is not simply a development coming in, trashing nature and then offsetting it somewhere else. It's very clear and very explicit in DEFRA's definition, and we'll also go through the principles, that it is achieved through following the mitigation hierarchy. And the onus is certainly on us within industry to come up with the evidence that we have followed this. So I've just mentioned our good practice principles, and these were published in 2016 by the three professional environmental institutes there. And what they did, they set out principles, which we'll go through in a moment, but they also set out a definition for biodiversity net gain, and that's very similar to the DEFRA's definition. So it's development that leaves biodiversity in a better state than before that development started. But it adds a slightly different emphasis than DEFRA, and it also talks about biodiversity net gain as an approach, whereby developers work with stakeholders to support their biodiversity goals. And what that means is it's us within industry, not just doing biodiversity net gain within our red line boundary, behind closed doors, not speaking with everyone. It's looking at our biodiversity net gain design and asking the question, how can we make a contribution? How can we support all these biodiversity net gain goals or biodiversity goals within the region, within the landscape, and even at national level? And it's that contribution piece that's really important. So these are our good practice principles, and there's 10 of them, and we've already touched on 2. So we know about apply the mitigation hierarchy, and we've just touched on principle 5, which is measurable, and also that contribution. I'd just like to touch on a few other principles, but they are all to be implemented as one package, if you like. But just to highlight a few of the other ones, principle 2 is really important. And that's about avoiding losing biodiversity that cannot be offset by gains elsewhere. And that means that irreplaceable habitats and statutory designated sites cannot be offset to achieve biodiversity net gain if there is an impact on those features, that's a permanent impact. There's no offset, there's no metric, that's a permanent loss. So those features are not part of the concept of biodiversity net gain, and that's really important to recognise that and to be transparent about that. Another principle to touch on, as we just mentioned, is measurable. And I really love metrics. They certainly changed my world in how I can communicate biodiversity to my engineers, to the boardroom. And we now have the updated biodiversity metric that's just been issued by Natural England. It is the beta version, so they are looking to get feedback to reissue the metric next year. But it certainly is part and parcel of the net gain approach. What's good practice, though, is to recognise that it's only a proxy. It cannot represent and is not intended to represent the variety and richness and diversity of habitats, of animals, of ecological functionality, of all the things that make up nature. So good practice is to use a metric, but to use it appropriately, where we have a very strong narrative that's a qualitative assessment that explains what those numbers actually mean. And that's a good practice for biodiversity. It's not making a decision based on a single number, but it's about understanding nature and then using numbers appropriately. Another key principle is the additional. And what this means, the additionality principle, is that net gain is an additional outcome for nature that wouldn't have otherwise occurred. And certainly from England, the examples that have been using are triple SIs, for example. So the government is mandated to keep triple SI, sites of special scientific interest, in a favourable condition. So that's going to happen. It's not okay for biodiversity net gain, if you like, to achieve that, because that's something that should happen anyway. The other example that's often brought up is countryside stewardship schemes. That's existing funding for environmental improvements, not just biodiversity. So biodiversity net gain, we have to think and we have to make sure that we have the evidence that it is an additional outcome for nature. And finally, out of the whole package of principles, but they are implemented as one package, the last one that we'd like to draw your attention to is Principle 9, about optimizing sustainability. Now, this is about prioritizing net gain. We don't lose sight of the net gain ambition or the goal, so we certainly prioritize that in everything that we do. But then afterwards, it's a question of thinking, well, what else can we do? Because if we do good stuff for nature, there's so many other benefits that we can gain. There's soil stability, recreation, carbon uptake, bioenergy, pollination, water management, are just a few things that can be generated. So it is about prioritizing net gain, but then thinking about those wider benefits that we can really draw on. To help with that, Natural England are developing what's called an ecometric. It's very much in the pilot stage at the moment, and they are intending this to be an initial assessment, if you like, an initial scoping study of change in ecosystem service provision under biodiversity net gain. There's also what's been published last year is a set of principles for people. So when you do biodiversity net gain, it's to make sure that we don't just think about the good stuff for biodiversity, we recognise that people are intimately connected with nature. They can be affected both positively but also negatively. And it's to make sure that we take that into account in our designs of net gain. So in summary, we have the good practice principles. Earlier this year, there's the guide to back up those principles. And biodiversity net gain is really about those measurable improvements. It's the key to really contribute towards those strategic biodiversity goals. It's making sure that we have these additional outcomes and optimizing the wider benefits. So I'll hand over to Rachel now.
Thanks, Julia. I'll just share my screen with everybody. And just check that you can see my first slide.
Yep, that looks good, Rachel.
Okay,
yep.
Thank you. So, thank you everybody. My name is Rachel Hoskin. I'm a director at Footprint Ecology. And I've been asked to give you the potted history of the progression of biodiversity net gain in England, starting with the initial government research and towards what will hopefully be a legislative requirement in the near future. So these are the things that I'm just going to mention and let you know a little bit about, from the Lawton Review back in 2010 through to our current proposed Environment Bill. So firstly, the Lawton Review. The Lawton Review, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, was a review of England's wildlife sites. It was an independent government commissioned review led by Professor John Lawton, entitled Making Space for Nature. And within the slide there is a quotation from Professor Sir John Lawton. His review found that there is compelling evidence that our wildlife sites are very much isolated and too small, and this is leading to significant declines, being exacerbated by other factors like climate change. He said that the situation is only likely to get worse. So he set out 24 recommendations within his report, a call for action for our wildlife. And this was really the start of that thinking about biodiversity restoration and towards biodiversity net gain now. So that was 2010, and then a couple of years later, some biodiversity offsetting pilots were run. So this was a recommendation actually within Lawton's review to run these biodiversity offsetting pilots. Now this was a set of 6 pilot areas to really test how the idea of offsetting for biodiversity losses could be undertaken on sites outside the development site boundary, and how that could be embedded into the planning system. So this was very, very focused on biodiversity offsetting, compensation, the last stage in the mitigation hierarchy. A lot of work went into the pilots. There was a panel of independent specialists working in Natural England, and they developed the first biodiversity metric. That first biodiversity metric was purposefully simple because it was designed specifically for use in the pilots. So those pilots ran for 2 years between 2012 and 2014. And whilst some very helpful information was gained from that, it was clearly too short a timescale for any meaningful offsetting to be seen on the ground and how that might have progressed. But a number of those 6 pilot areas have continued and are now working very positively with biodiversity net gain and are leading authorities in demonstrating how that can work. So since the pilots, there has been a fantastic progression over time towards a much more holistic net gain approach. So the pilots were very much specifically focusing on offsetting, off-site compensation, the last stage in the mitigation hierarchy. We're now seeing biodiversity net gain being much more about measurable gains that are locally relevant, thinking about how biodiversity net gain is an integral part of spatial planning, placemaking, and a focus on what's really important locally and what's important for local recovery and reconnecting habitats. So that sort of evolution of approach to biodiversity net gain means that biodiversity net gain is now really becoming an integral part of local planning, placemaking and growth, integral part of local plans. We've got an awful lot of local planning authorities now who are taking forward biodiversity net gain into their local plans and having specific policies on biodiversity net gain. And importantly, making it a thread throughout their local plan and linking it to the other aspects of sustainability. So Julia gave us about the good practice principles and the progression from those principles to the publication of the practical guide. That, together with the Lawton recommendations, sets a really good set of criteria for how biodiversity net gain should be implemented. And I've just picked out a few of those which are cross-cutting themes between the Lawton recommendations and the good practice principles and guidance. So importantly, we're thinking all the time about biodiversity net gain needs to be meaningful. How do we make sure that it's meaningful locally? How do we engage with stakeholders to make sure that they make a valid contribution? Making sure that net gains are long lasting and that management is committed to into the long term. How does biodiversity net gain link with wider environmental gains such as ecosystem services? And we've also been very grateful to our industry, which has really been leading exemplar in terms of the developments that they've come forward with, demonstrating biodiversity net gain and showing how biodiversity net gain can be integrated into different development types, infrastructure, housing, economic development. So we're very grateful to our industry for an enormous amount of case studies that we now have, and some of those are included in a companion document to the practical guide. So most recently we've had and the National Policy Framework, and this is really where we've got what we need to help embed biodiversity net gain into development decision making, because it's there in national planning policy that net gains need to be provided for biodiversity as an integral part of development. I just wanted to point out that the 25-year plan is primarily a document for England, but there is a sentence right at the start, which I've copied there, which refers to the fact that some aspects of the plan will apply to the UK as a whole. And I think that's important to stress that there are things in there which will be beneficial to the UK as a whole, not just for England. So the final step has been the proposal for biodiversity net gain to be a mandatory part of development. So in December 2018, our government ran a consultation. It ran for 10 weeks to see what people thought about the idea of making biodiversity net gain mandatory. They set 45 questions, and the topics included the scope of the requirement, how that should be measured, the type of development that should be included or excluded, how and for how long a net gain legacy should be secured, and some questions around the practical implementation issues within local planning authorities. Their response was 470 responses were received, and about a quarter of those actually came from local planning authorities. And we've also got development industry and ecological consultancies as a notable part of the response, and 17% were nature conservation organisations. So, and that's, you know, I've not listed all the small percentage there, but there's a good range of responses. So after the mandatory requirement consultation, we then had the update to the biodiversity metric. So Natural England have now provided, as Julia explained, of the metric, and that has been developed with extensive user feedback on the initial biodiversity metric for the pilots from 2012, and also a lot of input from wide-ranging activities, various events and panel discussions to help inform the update. The main thing that's changed is an improved consideration of ecological connectivity. That's now a really important and integral part of the metric calculation. And Natural England have also extended the range of habitat types that are included. And the other brilliant thing is that the metric now includes a calculation tool. So that was earlier this year, and then during 2019 the Environment Bill has been progressing. So we initially had a spring statement from the Chancellor referring to the inclusion of mandatory biodiversity net gain, and the Queen's speech referred to the Environment Bill as well, and then we had the Environment Bill policy statement published last month. So the Environment Bill has passed its second reading in the House of Commons just a short while ago, but obviously that's now come to a halt because we've had the dissolution of Parliament in preparation for the general election. So with the general election looming, we've no idea what will happen afterwards in terms of the Environment Bill, but obviously the hope is that that will be picked up again in due course. Just setting out a few things that are in the Environment Bill. So we are anticipating the following will be key parts of the legislation. A 2-year transition period. So the mandatory requirement will have a 2-year transition period to enable everybody to get biodiversity net gain ready. A really interesting part of the proposed legislation, and it's clear within the policy statement, is there's a strong focus on locally driven responses in terms of securing meaningful biodiversity net gain. And there's a clear link to biodiversity net gain with local nature recovery strategies, which are another part of the Environment Bill where there will be a requirement for recovery strategies to be prepared for local areas. It's clear now that a 10% biodiversity net gain needs to be demonstrated, and that will be within the legislation. And it's also clear that exemptions are likely to be quite limited. There will be exemptions, but there won't be very many, and so most things will be included with a biodiversity net gain requirement, but it may be that there's a more simplified requirement for possibly for minor developments or small development sites, and possibly an exemption where a brownfield site has considerable viability issues. And the other important thing is that the Environment Bill suggests a 30-year management period will be in place, and a requirement for habitats that are created or enhanced as part of a biodiversity net gain commitment. So all of those things are incredibly positive, and so we are keeping our fingers crossed that after the election the Environment Bill will be picked up again and proceed through the process of becoming legislation. Okay, I'll hand over to Vicky. I'll just close my sharing. I should have closed now, Vicky, so hopefully you're free to go.
Can I just check that everyone can see my screen and that you can hear me okay?
Yep, it's all good, Vicky.
Brilliant, thank you. So thanks, Rachel, for giving us that overview of what's happened in England. I think it's very useful for us all on the webinar to hear the progression in England. Not just because many of us likely will deal with development in England as well as Scotland, but also because England are that little bit ahead of us compared to where we're at in Scotland with biodiversity net gain. But it's very similar in that it's very much industry driven. So it's useful to have that as a backdrop when we now look at how things have progressed in Scotland so far. But before I go on to look specifically at Scotland and what we're doing in the biodiversity net gain arena, I want to bring us all to the bigger picture, if you like, and look at where the drivers for biodiversity net gain are actually coming from. Now, a lot of us will be very aware of our international biodiversity targets set by the Convention on Biological Diversity. And CBD was set up back in the early 90s during the recognition that we were losing our habitats globally at quite a drastic rate. Now, they've set a number of targets for biodiversity over the years. We did have a target that took us up to 2010, and globally we missed that target. So in 2010, a new target was set up that ran from 2011 to 2020, and that's our IHE biodiversity targets. Now, that set a range of 20 different targets. Now, the target that we're focusing on here is target number 5, which sets as a target for 2020, so next year now. And it really set out that we should be, the rate of loss for all habitats, for all natural habitats, should be at least halved, as you can see there, and where possible brought close to zero. So that's really where our no net loss kind of target started to come in. Now, after the IHE biodiversity targets were set, the EU then got together and set the biodiversity strategy to 2020 for all member states. And they set the bar just that little bit higher, where they actually said that no net loss was our target, and restoring at least 15% of degraded ecosystems. So we're at the point where, as I say, 2020, as we all know, is just around the corner. The CBD is meeting at the moment to establish what will be our next target. And already there's been discussions about what that might be. If we had, close to zero and no net loss, we can expect that it may well be something towards going to net gain, and certainly specialists working for the EU have suggested that that might be a target that will be set within the EU. Whether we'll be inside or outside of that, we don't know, but certainly our international targets are coming. So what will they be? So it's worth keeping that in mind. That's globally what we're looking at. And we do have now across the world around 100 countries, or over 100 countries, that have either a policy or legal requirement for no net loss or net gain. So coming on to Scotland then, what do we have in terms of strategies and legislation and policy that might help us to get biodiversity net gain into more developments? Well, we have, back in 2004, the Scottish Government set out their biodiversity strategy. And that's the first document you can see there on the right-hand side, Scottish Biodiversity. It's in your hands. Now, after the IHE targets were set, the Scottish Government then wrote this other document in line with the targets, and that's the 2020 Challenge for Scotland's Biodiversity. And I've just pulled out a little clip there of what's said in that document. The document really is a route map to get us to 2020 and sets out our strategic priorities for biodiversity. The Scottish Government report on our progress against our biodiversity strategy. And it actually identified that our progress towards target 5 of the IHE biodiversity targets was insufficient, and that we needed a lot more action to meet the target by 2020. So that's the position that we're in at the moment. We also have our environment strategy being drafted. There was a consultation on that last year, and the consultation responses that came in this year were quite varied. The environment strategy covers things from climate change, circular economy, waste management, but it also looks at biodiversity. And the consultation responses were quite clear in it, that it said that although the vision for biodiversity within the environment strategy, and the environment strategy as a whole, is quite positive, it does need to be more ambitious on biodiversity, and it needs greater clarity on the outcomes. Now, the strategy has not been finalised as yet. It was due for finalisation by the end of this year, but obviously the government has other things that have kept it from doing that. But it's worth keeping an eye out for that to see if we do get greater targets in there. In terms of legislation, we do have a couple of pieces of legislation that set out back in 2004 the biodiversity duty on public bodies, and that was to further the conservation of biodiversity. And then 2011 we have the Wayne Act, which many of us will be well aware of, and that required public bodies then to start reporting on compliance with the biodiversity duty every 3 years. So it really brought in just that reporting element. And last year it was published that wasn't being upheld by a number of public bodies, but I think that there has been progress in that regard. But that's for public bodies. Where are we in terms of development now? We have our planning policy and our planning framework for development in Scotland. the Scottish Planning Policy was last updated in 2014, and you can see there the text from the planning policy actually aligns with the mitigation hierarchy. So it talks of avoidance and further fragmentation or isolation of habitats, and it talks about restoration of degraded habitats. So as I say, that chimes in quite well with the mitigation hierarchy. So it's quite good wording there. It does say seek benefits. It doesn't gives a requirement for benefits or positive benefits. But when we look to our National Planning Framework 3, and that's the equivalent of England's NPPF, we don't then have that wording coming through into NPF 3, unfortunately. Now, at the moment, the Scottish Government are updating what they do in terms of planning, and the Planning Act, the planning bill's been worked on for the last number of years. The Planning Act it's just become an act earlier this year. And as far as I can see, the discussion around, or the text around biodiversity, and where we might have something that hints towards a target of biodiversity net gain, is in this section here for development planning. And it says really that an environmental impact assessment might include essentially a biodiversity net gain assessment report. So looking at net positive effects in biodiversity. Now that's really already what we're starting to do within Scotland when we look at industry. That the developers that are looking at this are starting to include biodiversity net gain assessments within their EIA, but that's very much a voluntary thing. It doesn't here say within the Planning Act that there's a requirement for that, nor does it set out a kind of target for no net loss or net gain within development. So with the Planning Act, what do we see then? What's the future then for us? Now, we've got NPF 3 at the moment. NPF 4 then will start to be drafted next year with publication in 2021. If we are to achieve or require biodiversity net gain within development, we surely then need to have some sort of text in NPF 4 to be able to do that. And relating back again to England, that's certainly what's happened in England when the NPPF was updated with stronger wording and a stronger policy requirement for biodiversity net gain. That's really what tipped the balance more so in terms of industry really taking up biodiversity net gain. So we have the opportunity there, you know, with NPF 4 being drafted next year, we'll know by that point what the newest target from the Commission on Biological Diversity is. You know, it'd be interesting to hear, and when we go into the polling side of things, what your views are as an audience, you know, and as ecological practitioners and people working in industry, in the development industry across Scotland, what your views might be on whether we should have that within policy or whether we should have it within legislation. But even though we don't yet have the wording that we maybe need in policy and legislation, there are things happening in Scotland in terms of biodiversity net gain. There was a workshop a number of years ago that looked at biodiversity net gain in development planning. It was determined at that time that it wasn't quite right for development, but that if development should have moved forward in that and showed more of a positive uptake, that the Scottish Government would look at that again. So we are certainly at that place where the industry is taken up biodiversity net gain. The metric that's being used in Scotland is the DEFRA metric, which, as Julie mentioned and Rachel mentioned, has just been updated now to the Natural England metric version 2. It is fit for purpose for Scotland. There's some tweaks that we need to make, but it certainly is what we've been using. And there's a range then of developers as well that are looking at biodiversity net gain and implementing it. And one of the key developers is Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks, and Frances will talk in just a moment. Frances will talk in just a moment about their progression with biodiversity net gain. But active in Scotland as well, we have Network Rail, who have a corporate commitment to biodiversity net gain, as does Barratt Homes. CalMac have used biodiversity net gain assessments to have a look at their estate. Scottish Power are looking at it as well, and have started to use it as well, as has Stirling Council. And there are a number of other local authorities and developers who are talking about it, who are looking to use it within Scotland. So again, very much industry driven, which is a really interesting time and place. So I'll hand over now to Frances, who then talk about Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks and their development with biodiversity net gain.
Yeah, thanks Vicky for that. well, the time. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see the slides now. So can everybody see the slides?
Yep.
Yeah, great. Well, my name's Francis Williams. I'm an environmental project manager for SSEN. We're part of the SSE group, and we deal with 132 kV overhead lines and substations within the north of Scotland. So we do have a variety of different project sizes, from very small permitted development sites to large scale kind of EIA developments, both overhead lines and also we do large substations. Why are we doing BNG? I think it's probably one of the questions that we do get asked, and we do have an ambition which I've stated on this slide, and our ambition is to ensure that our activities not only maintain the existing balance but also help to enhance the biodiversity in our area to achieve a net gain. Well, so we were looking on about how we were actually going to kind of achieve this. So back in 2017. We started to look at biodiversity net gain because we were aware that it was being carried out in England. And with support from WSP, who have been doing a lot of work of this down in England, we trialled the metric, the old metric, on several substation sites throughout our area to try and get an idea of how biodiversity net gain could actually work on some of our development sites. I have got to say at this point that it was trying to retrofit a BNG assessment, which isn't the ideal situation, but that's the situation we're in. Going beyond that, we've also just trialed the DEFRA metric on an overhead line project together with Balfour Beatty because we're aware that overhead lines have different challenges as opposed to substations. So after we'd done the work on the substations, we actually came around to the idea that we could implement biodiversity net gain on our sites, but having trialed it on these 4 different sites, they were in Stornoway, they were up at Spittal, in Fort Augustus, and down at Tomatin as well. There were a few issues that we felt needed a Scottish specific toolkit and guidance to make sure that it actually worked for us. And together with WSP again, we've done quite a lot of work on developing toolkits that work for us, and also developing guidance for both internal staff and also the consultants that we use to deliver the biodiversity net gain assessments. And out of that, process, there was a lot of consultation, both internally as well as externally, throughout the summer of this year, and it culminated in the publication of the document we called A Network for Net Zero, our approach to implementing biodiversity net gain, which some of you may have seen. So our commitments basically are on this slide. So for new infrastructure projects, we are proposing to do a number of things. The main thing to focus on is projects gaining consent from 2020 onwards will achieve no net loss, and projects gaining consent from 2025 onwards will achieve net gain. We believe we need this kind of stepped approach because of the relative infancy of biodiversity net gain within Scotland. We also understand and acknowledge the fact that we also have impacts when we upgrade, maintain, or operate our activities, and a lot of internal consultation has been undertaken to try and understand how we bring in biodiversity net gain in those lower impact situations. Just quickly running through how we apply biodiversity net gain to our projects. Really, this slide is really there to make the point that we build biodiversity right in at the very start of the development of any project. And it becomes, and as the project develops and you get more clarity on what the project is, the level of detail and the level of data that is required and that is there, it gets fed in. And to help support this, what we've developed two toolkits. We have the Biodiversity Optioneering Toolkit, and then we have the full Biodiversity Net Gain Toolkit. The initial toolkit, so the Optioneering Toolkit, is a very early stage toolkit to really highlight how many biodiversity units there are on each of the options that we have for a particular project. And that feeds then into the site optioneering process, which also involves economic issues and also kind of technical issues. But the idea there is to really bring in biodiversity right at the very start of any project that we develop. And then once we go through the development process, we would then implement a full biodiversity net gain assessment, which is the more kind of complicated toolkit that's on that slide there. So going back to the trials that we initially did on the old DEFRA metric, there were certain things that we weren't particularly comfortable with. We found that some of the condition scores didn't always reflect what was on the ground. Irreplaceable habitats has been mentioned by Julia before. Peatland habitats are common in Scotland, and we believe there are examples of successful peatland restoration, so we weren't comfortable with any peatland being designated as an irreplaceable habitat. There's also other things that come into trying to achieve biodiversity net gain. For example, if you're felling trees and the woodland replacement requirements that you may have on your sites do sometimes impact on whether or not biodiversity net gain is achievable on a site as well. And we also have some concerns about the habitats that take a long time to reach target condition, and we didn't, and there shouldn't be a disincentive there to try and restore, say, peatland habitats that would take a long time to recover. So our key amendments, we've kind of broken this down into what we've done now and what we'll do in the future. In our consultation documents, we have stated that we will only classify peatland of moderate or above condition as irreplaceable. We've also changed some of the distinctiveness scores for native pine forest because we found they weren't being scored correctly in the original metric. Future work, we're going to have a look at condition assessments for the habitats that are specific to Scotland. There are a few habitats there that we don't think are kind of assessed correctly, and we have to look at the method and approach for identifying connectivity and strategic location within Scotland. Quick example here, I know we're running out of time, is Tomatin substation just south of Inverness. You can see on the picture on the left-hand side, it's mostly in coniferous forest, and on the right-hand side is a recent picture of what the substation actually looks like now. As part of the biodiversity net gain assessment, table 3 sets out how, what actually the biodiversity baseline is. And here it was mostly coniferous plantation. As you would note on that, or going back to the original slide, there's a large area of purple. That is peatland habitat, which was assessed as good condition, so is irreplaceable habitat. Therefore, it wasn't considered within the biodiversity net gain assessment, because as a whole, the project can't achieve biodiversity net gain if it impacts on irreplaceable habitats, but you can still aim to get net gain in the non-irreplaceable habitats. So initially we had a landscape plan that was developed, and we did a biodiversity net gain assessment on that, and was mostly focused towards replanting broad-leaved habitats and with some dry heath there. And out of that landscape plan, there was an increase of about 3% in your non-irreplaceable habitats. Working together with WSP, that landscape plan was reworked to try and encourage more diverse habitats within the area, and you can see the enhanced landscape plan there. So in summary, for that project, the majority of the development site was coniferous plantation woodland, which is 82%, but we had this small section of blanket bog. As that blanket bog was found to be in good condition, that makes it irreplaceable habitats. So we tried to avoid impacts where we could on these irreplaceable habitats, but then we were still aiming to achieve no net loss or net gain in the irreplaceable habitats. So working on WSP's amended plans for that site, initially we had this 3% gain, but following these recommendations that have been implemented, we are now looking at a 34% increase in biodiversity units on that site. But what I would also stress is that you don't only focus on percentage increases or just biodiversity units, that it shouldn't preclude you from doing other initiatives on the site. For example, we work together with the Dragonfly Trust to kind of enhance other species as well. They don't get taken into account for BNG, but it doesn't stop you from doing that. Anyway, that was a quick whistle-stop tour, and I will hand you back to Kirsty, if I can.
Thank you very much, Francis. I will now launch a series of 4 polls for you all to answer. So I'll launch the first poll, which hopefully you all can see. So the question is, do you consider biodiversity net gain in your work? Yes, always, yes, often, rarely, or never / not yet. So I'll just give you a few seconds to make your choice. Okay. Looks like most of you have now voted, so I will end the poll and share the results with you. There you go. So, yeah, 16% say yes, always, 37% yes, often, 22% rarely, and 26% never or not yet. Thank you. So, poll number 2 now. Do you think biodiversity net gain is a good tool to achieve wins for nature from development? Yes for all developments, yes for specific developments, comments in the chat would be welcomed, or no. Again, I'll give you a few more seconds to make your decision. Okay, I'll end the poll now and share the results with you. So yes for developments has come out on top at 65%, and 34% think yes for specific developments and 2% think no. Poll number 3, which I will now launch. Would you like further training from CIEEM on biodiversity net gain? If so, what? So yes, the basics and principles only. Yes, the basic principles and metrics. Or yes, condition assessment. This could be done alone, being field-based, or in a combination with other aspects as above, including UK HABs could also come in here somewhere, as the latest condition assessment in metric 2.0 includes and is consistent with. Just give you a few more seconds to make your choice. Okay, and I'll end the poll there and share the results with you. So 1% think yes, and 42% think yes, the basics and principles and metrics, and 56% yes, condition assessment. Okay, our final poll now, which hopefully you can all see. Should there be a requirement for development to deliver biodiversity net gain in Scotland? If so, what type of requirement? The choices are yes, national policy requirement, yes, local policy requirements, yes, legal requirement, or no. And again, I'll give you a few more seconds to make your choice. Okay, I'll end the poll now and share the final results with you. So 42% think yes, national policy requirement, 10% yes, local policy requirement, and 50% yes, legal requirement. Thank you very much for everybody for taking part in the polling, and I will now hand over to Tom, who will facilitate the Q&A session.
Thank you very much. I think we've got a slide that's going to come up. Vicky, if you'd like to share your screen. Perfect. There we go. There's a picture of us all, so now you know what we all look like. This is our panel. You've heard from Julia, Rachel, Vicky, and Francis. We've got quite a lot of questions. I don't think we're going to get through all of them in the next 9 minutes. Some fantastic and really important questions. So I think this, if nothing else, opens up the fact that we probably need to have more discussions and perhaps more webinars like this. I wanted to bring out 1 or 2 questions first, and I'm going to come back to the people on the panel to answer these. There were a couple of questions about Scottish Government's current thinking on biodiversity net gain, and whether there's any intention to roll out similar legislation as the Environment Bill in England for something in Scotland, and is there further insight into the work on the NPF4 and whether there'll be positive effects for biodiversity within that. I don't know whether Vicky or anybody else on the call, perhaps Jason, would be able to answer that. Vicky, do you want to kick that off? And then we'll come to Jason. You may be muted, Vicky.
Hold on a moment.
Hello, I can hear you now.
Hello, can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, we can, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I would suggest at the moment that the Scottish Government are still forming their view on it. We haven't had anything official as yet, but certainly there have been a number of people that have been speaking to Scottish Government. CIEEM most recently put together a policy paper on biodiversity net gain in Scotland, and they've met with a few people within Scottish Government to start discussing it. SNH are very much aware of biodiversity net gain and have shown support for biodiversity net gain as well. So I think it's the next step is really to bring the kind of industry viewpoint to Scottish Government and start really having those discussions and establish what their view is and whether they are supportive of it or not. In terms of NPF4, that would be along the same lines. It's now really time to speak with Scottish Government, and if they do have the view of supporting biodiversity net gain, then it would be the next step to try and get some wording into NPF4. So we don't know, the answer is we don't know as yet, but hopefully we'll get some answers on that soon enough in the coming year.
Thank you, Vicky. I note one comment saying if it's not a legal requirement, it probably won't happen. I think that's a perspective I would have taken a little while ago, and what's interesting is it hasn't been a legal requirement in England for at all, and it still isn't a legal requirement, and yet it's happening all over the place, and loads of people are picking it up. So I think there's other reasons for doing this other than just because it's good for biodiversity. Jason, I don't know if you're on the line, if you wanted to pick up
I'm here. Sorry.
on that, because I know you're doing lots of work on this engagement at the moment.
Yeah, so I mean, I can only repeat what Vicky's already said, really, in that. So we have engaged with Scottish Government, both elected ministers and with civil servants who are both very keen on the idea. SNH seem to be happier to move things along a bit further. So we've got some things in the pipeline, planning first an informal event where they will be involved, and if that's successful, then potentially doing something a bit more formal. as one of their events, where we can hopefully get some SNH staff and some actual practitioners in the room together and start discussing this. But they're very keen on this, and we know that they've been sharing that policy document internally.
Thank you, Jason. That's really helpful. So something that's actively being discussed and engaged with at the moment. I wanted to come to Francis just to ask a couple of specific questions, if that's okay, Francis. Are the toolkits that we've developed with you, but you've developed, going to be available for people to use and take away and use on their own projects?
Yeah, I thought that was going to be a quick question, actually. Oh, we are a regulated business, so we would have to talk to Ofgem whether we are allowed to share the toolkits that have been developed for our projects, because of the issues of people using them for commercial gain.
Yeah, of course. But for those people working on your projects, they'll be made available to them for those specific pieces of work.
Yeah. So for any consultant or who contractor works for us, we would expect them to use our toolkits and to follow our guidance.
There was a secondary question I wanted to come to you while I've got you, Francis, is around the explanation of why woodland replacement is an issue. And on some sites. Could you articulate that just to make that crystal clear for people?
I think because we have to show no net loss in woodland cover, sometimes it can impact on the habitats that you actually have around on your site. And the biodiversity improvements that you can get by other habitats, for example, wildflower meadows or grasslands, are often better than if you then have to plant up, say, semi-improved grasslands with trees, kind of just to fulfill that percentage of woodland cover that you have to meet. So that's really the reason why we've found it a bit of a struggle sometimes to balance the two. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's particularly a challenge where you've got plantation woodland on a habitat that might once have been something other than plantation woodland and much nicer peatland, perhaps. Yeah, thank you for that, Francis. That was clear to me. I hope that was to the questioner as well. I'm going to come to Julia and Rachel, I'll open this up to you. We've been asked, what does green infrastructure, such as green roofs and green spaces, how does that link with biodiversity net gain? And how does the metric help us understand our links to green infrastructure? So there's a lot of fantastic work in Scotland on green infrastructure. Are either of you would like to say something about that? Jump in, whoever would like to.
I can start initially, if that's okay, and then I'll hand over to Rachel.
Yeah.
Yeah, really good question. So the updated metric by Natural England, which is the beta version, has a lot more urban habitats and it has green infrastructure features in there as well. So one of the limitations, if you like, of the first metric was that the habitats were so broad scale, it didn't take into account, things that we can do in urban areas, and those are greatly undervalued. So anyone working on a green infrastructure project, I really encourage you to test out the metric, and there's a feedback form on the Natural England website. They are super keen to get feedback from practitioners to then update the metric next year. So it will be great to see how it works, to see whether you think it reflects, the true value of those features, and to feed that back. But it is now incorporated into the metric.
Yeah, as well as now seeing it feature in the metric, I think local planning authorities who are taking forward biodiversity net gain into their planning functions, some of those are very urban authorities, and they are predominantly dealing with brownfield sites within towns and cities, and so it's very much about thinking, how can we achieve biodiversity net gain in an urban situation using sort of structural biodiversity net gains, such as green roofs and green walls, and greening the urban environment. So it's very much part of the thinking for local planning authorities, which have an urban context. And I think now we're seeing biodiversity net gain policies coming forward in local plans. They are talking about green infrastructure as an integral part. So biodiversity net gain policies are very much either the policy is about biodiversity net gain and green infrastructure together, or in a biodiversity net gain policy, when it talks about what gains can be made, then the text is talking about green infrastructure. And of course, now we've got the requirement for the Nature Recovery Network work. It's going to continue to be much more joined together, so that looking at green infrastructure opportunities will be the places where we're looking for biodiversity net gain opportunities.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Julia. I'm afraid we've got lots more questions, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. I think there's real opportunity to have a further discussion about this in Scotland. I would like to just say thank you to everybody for all of your questions, and thank you to all of our speakers as well. I'm going to pass back now to CIEEM. I don't know who's picking it up from here, just to say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, I think you said everything. Thank you to everyone for joining us and to the speakers. We'll be sending a feedback form out this afternoon with a link to the recorded version of the webinar and a link to the consultation. And yes, we hope you found this webinar useful and the discussions continue. So thank you very much, everybody.